Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 11. And in this module we're going to talk about more aspects of rhythm notation. So just a few things that we haven't covered yet about rhythm notation. So we'll talk about how to correctly notate rhythms to reflect the meter. We'll define the term syncopation. We'll define the terms tuplet, triplet, and duplet. And we'll talk about how to determine if a stem should go up or down on the staff, and also talk about the rules for beaming things like eighth notes and 16th notes and things like that. All right, so notating the meter. This is really important. Rhythms should be notated so that the meter is always clear, right? And so the meter is just, well, essentially how many beats you have in a measure, okay? And so we always need to notate our rhythms and use the rest, beams, ties, and dots to show the location of each beat in the measure. Okay, so whenever you look at a piece of music, you should be able to tell exactly where each beat of the meter is in the measure. Okay, any notation that obscures where those beats are should not be used. That is wrong. So for example, something like this, this is in 4/4, we have an eighth note, a half rest, a quarter note, and another eighth note, right? And to me, I have no idea where those 4 beats are in this measure. Because it's 4/4, there should be 4 beats. But if you look at the way this is written, there's really no way to tell where those 4 beats are, right? So, like, obviously beat 1 is on that eighth note, right? But where's beat 2? Does beat 2 happen right after that eighth note? Well, that can't be the case, right? Because an eighth note doesn't take up a whole beat, right? And so then where is beat 3? Beat 3 would be somewhere in the middle of that half rest, right? So it's like, if you look at this, it's very confusing because you don't know where the beat is. You have no association between what you're looking at and the pulse, right? The places where the beat falls. So this is an example of notation that is not correct because you cannot see where the beats are in this measure. But you can rewrite this to show where the beats are. So we're going to rewrite this so we can see where every single beat is in this measure. So what we'll do is we'll take that eighth note, right? And we'll use an eighth rest to complete the beat. So a lot of this renotating is just making sure that each beat looks like it's complete, okay? So we take that eighth note and we have to show that that eighth note doesn't complete the beat. So what we do is we add an eighth rest, right? So we're basically taking that half rest and we're splitting it up. And we're putting one of the eighth notes in that half rest and combining it, right? Putting it in the same place as our eighth note note, right? And so that completes beat 1 there, because an eighth note plus an eighth rest is beat 1. So now it's clear where beat 1 is and where it ends. For beat 2, we'll take one of the quarter notes out of that half note rest, right? And we'll use that, right, to represent the location of beat 2. So now you can clearly see where beat 2 is. Okay, and then we'll complete that half note rest, right, by taking the other eighth note out from it, the eighth note that's left. And then we're left with, the next thing is a quarter note, right? And so we'll split that up into an eighth note and tie that to another eighth note, because an eighth plus eighth equals quarter, and then put that eighth note there by itself, and we'll beam it together to show where beat 4 is, okay? And so what I've written on the bottom is the exact same sound, right? The exact same rhythm, the exact same piece of music, but now it's written much clearer because of the way I've used the rests and the ties and the beaming. Now you can see where all 4 beats are in this measure, okay? So that first one, right? You don't want to do that because it doesn't show you where the beats are in the measure. It's really confusing to look at. You don't know where the beats are, right? The second one is great though because it shows you where all 4 beats are in the measure. So when you're reading it, you know where the beat is you know, relative to all the notes that you have to play, right? So the rule of thumb is you always want to show where all the beats are in the measure. Okay, sometimes the division of the beat is not clear when rhythms are written. So you also want to make sure that you show the division of the beats as well as the beats themselves. And so something like this, right? This is 6/8, and I know that 6/8 is a compound meter, so I know that all of the beats are divided into 3 parts, right? So things should be grouped together in groups of 3. But if you just look at this, right, you can see that it looks like it's groups of 2 because you have 2 eighth notes beamed together, a quarter note, right? That's a group of 2. And then that's tied to another group of 2 eighth notes. So even though this has the right number of eighth notes in it, it's not showing, right, the right division of the beats. Okay? So they look like simple beats. They look like beats that are divided into 2s, but that is not the case, right? This is compound meter, so they should look like they're grouped into groups of 3. So what you do is you use a beam and you split up any notes that are groups of 2 as well. So we'll take those first 3 notes and we'll rewrite them as 3 eighth notes, right? And one of them will be tied because that note needs to still be the correct length, right? And we'll beam all 3 of those together because these are groups of 3 since they're compound beats. And then to complete that note in the middle, right, it's an eighth note tied to a quarter, right? And before it was a quarter tied to an eighth note. So it's the exact same length. It just looks like the correct division now, right? And then we'll use that eighth note at the end. And it's pretty common practice in 6/8 to use eighth notes and quarter notes as part of the same group. So when your eye sees that, you kind of put those together to make it look like a group of 3. So now, what did look like simple beats, which was incorrect, looks like compound beats, which is correct. So that's what you want to do. Okay? All right. So some other things about this kind of stuff. One thing to consider is syncopation. A syncopation is a type of rhythm in which normally weak beats or divisions of the beat are accented. So something like, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, ta 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 ta, right? That's a syncopated rhythm. Because what I was doing is I was putting an emphasis on not the beat, but the time that's in between each beat, right? So 3, 4, ta, 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 right? So the tas I'm singing happen not on the beats, not on the snaps that I'm giving, right? But right after the snaps. So that's an example of a kind of syncopation. And syncopations sometimes are deliberately notated to obscure the beat, right? So something like this, right, looks weird. You can't really see where the beats are. But since it's syncopated, this is actually considered okay. And this is the only time it's kind of okay to not show the location of every beat. And everyone has a different opinion about this. I actually kind of disagree because I think it's always important to see where the beats are. It's just easier to read. But, you know, it's kind of one of those things that's common practice. So you need to be aware of it. You'll often see something like this when it's syncopated. All right. Another rhythm symbol is a tuplet, right? Or a tuplet, sorry. And a tuplet are just rhythm symbols that are used when a beat is split into an unusual number of divisions, okay? And by unusual, I mean things like groups of 5 or groups of 7. And in some cases, like if you're in a simple meter, that can also be groups of 3 or groups of 6, right? Or if you're in a compound meter, that can be groups of 2 or groups of 4. Because in those meters, right, with those beats, those are usually divided into 2 or 3 parts. So if you're going to divide them into 3 or 2 parts, right, then you're going to need to use a symbol to represent that. Okay, but in general, tuplets are just used to represent when a beat is split into an unusual number of divisions. And so, for example, you could use a tuplet to divide this quarter note into 5 equal parts. And it would look like this, right? So it's 5/16 notes with a 5 over it to say that they all fit into one beat. Okay? You could even split this whole note into 7 parts, right? We normally don't have anything that would divide that evenly into 7 parts and all still fit into one beat, right? So you can use a tuplet to do that too. So you can see I have 7 quarter notes written there with a bracket and a 7, and that just means that all 7 of those fit into one beat. All right. Now there are a lot of rules about how to notate that, and it doesn't really matter because we're not going to be doing that too much. But, you know, just be aware that I think the rule is like you have to use the next smallest note value to represent it. So when I did that 5-tuplet, which is called a quintuplet, right? 4/16 notes, right, would make up a quarter. But since I'm stretching that out, I have to use 16th notes to represent the quintuplet. So that's the rule when you're writing tuplets. All right. The most common kind of tuplet is called a triplet. And as the name implies, a triplet divides a non-dotted note into 3 equal parts. And by non-dotted, I just mean a regular note without a dot, right? And so that just means a simple beat, because any note that doesn't have a dot after it can divide into 2 parts, so that's a simple beat. But a triplet kind of breaks that rule. So if we wanted to make an exception for this beat and divide it into 3 parts instead of 2, we would use a triplet. Okay, and you can see it's eighth notes with a 3 over it, right? And so like if it were a half note being divided into 3 parts, you would use 3/4 notes with a 3 over it, right? If it were an eighth note being divided into 3 parts, you'd use 3/16 notes with a 3 over it, okay? But that's a triplet. A triplet creates a compound beat, right? A compound division out of something that is normally a simple division. And of course, you have the reverse too. So a duplet divides a dotted note into 2 equal parts. And so a dotted note normally divides into 3, right? A dotted note normally is a compound beat, so it would normally divide into 3 parts. But if we want to divide it into 2 parts, we have to use a duplet. And you can see that it's just 2 eighth notes with a 2 over it. Okay? So triplets and duplets are by far the most common ones you'll see. All right, let's talk about stems and beams. And we talk about stems when we're talking about rhythm because the rhythm in our notation system is determined by the things that are attached to the notes, right? As well as the shape of the notes. So you need to know the correct direction of a stem for any note that you write. And so the direction of the stem depends on the height of the note on the staff. So you can see that the 2 notes on the left, right, those are below the middle line of the staff. And whenever a note is written below the middle line of the staff, we make the stem point upwards. Okay? So that F and that A, their stems are going to point upwards because they're below the middle line on the staff. And stems that are on notes that are either on the middle line or above the middle line, they go downwards, right? And so that B and that E there, they both have stems that will point downwards instead of up. And that's simply just to make it look nice, you know, because you don't want your stems pointing up. Now, technically, there are a couple things with this. Technically, the one in the middle line can go either way. I just kind of made the decision that will make them point down. But it's okay, actually, if you make it point up. It's just kind of a choice. It doesn't really matter. And then you'll also see things with stems where if you have 2 parts written on the same line, so something like in a church hymnal, right? Or choir music, or maybe even instrument parts sometimes, right? You'll have 2 parts that are written on the same line. In that case, the upper part will have all of its stems pointing upwards, and the lower part will have all of its stems pointing downwards. And that's just a way to make it obvious which part, right, will follow which notes, okay? So whenever you have multiple parts on the same line, it will actually break these rules. It won't follow these rules, right? But if you just have a single line of music on a line, it will follow these rules. Okay? And then the final thing is to talk about beams. And so beams are, I think we talked about it before, but you use beams on any notes that have flags, right? And so those are things like 8th notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, 64ths, etc. Things that have flags, right? You want to beam together any of those notes as long as they're part of the same beat. Okay? And so if you look at something like this, we have 8th note, 16ths, right? 4/16ths, another 8th note, 2/16ths, and a quarter note. To me, that looks like a complete mess, right? I would have absolutely no idea how to play that unless I spent maybe a couple minutes looking at it, right? Because it just doesn't show you where the beats are, right? It doesn't show you in an obvious way what that should sound like. So to fix that, to fix all those flags and that mess of nonsense there, right, we'll beam together notes that belong in the same beat. And so those first two eighth notes, right, look much better when you beam them together. And you beam them together because two eighth notes make up a quarter note, which is the beat, right? So that first beat divides into two eighth notes, and so we beam those all together. Now the next four 16th notes, right, they all belong in the same beat because there are four 16th notes in a quarter note. So you beam all those together as well. And now you can see it's already looking a lot cleaner. And then that eighth note and those two 16ths, those all belong in one beat as well. So those are all beamed together. And you can see that, for eighth notes, it's a single beam. And then for 16th notes, it's a double beam. And those can all be beamed together, right? So you have I guess it's called compound beams, right? But you have the main beam with the eighth note, and then whenever it's a 16th note, you would add another beam. And then obviously, if it was 30 seconds, you'd have three beams, etc. Okay? And then finally, that last quarter note, there's no flag on that, so you don't need to beam it to anything. Plus, it takes up a beat on its own. And so that's right there is the final notation, right? That looks so much better. That's the kind of thing that you could just look at and be like, okay, I know what this is going to sound like, right? There's no staring at it for minutes trying to decode what is meant, right? All those crazy flags and things have all been compacted and cleaned up. So now we see where all four beats are. We see how things are grouped together. It's just a lot cleaner and a lot nicer looking. So you are good. Okay. So those are some things about rhythm notation to keep in mind. And you'll be applying these things to the exercises in the assignment coming up. Yeah, and if you have any questions, post it to the forum. I'll get to it as soon as I can. Otherwise, you can ask in the Zoom session or by email. However you want to get in touch with me is fine. And other than that, thanks for watching, and have a great day.